It was 1 o'clock in the morning when the world around me finally shattered. The night air was heavy damp with the smell of rain that had fallen earlier in the evening. The street was silent except for the faint hum of a transformer somewhere down the block. Porch lights glowed weakly across the quiet neighborhood, each house asleep, each window dark. But at that hour, I was not sleeping. I was stumbling, blood running down my face ribs, screaming with each shallow breath, dragging my body toward the only place I thought I could find safety. I collapsed against Linda Hayes's front door. She was my neighbor, a woman in her 50s who still believed in the kindness of community. My hands shook as I tried to knock, but my strength gave way, and I slid down against the wooden frame. The world spun. I pressed one arm tight across my stomach, trying to hold myself together. My vision blurred with tears and sweat and the dark red smear of my own blood dripping to the porch floor. The words of my father still echoed in my ears. I could hear them as clearly as if he were standing over me. "I only have one son." The phrase hit harder than his fists, harder than the final blow that had knocked the breath from my lungs. I only have one son. In that moment, it was as though my entire life had been erased, as if my existence meant nothing but defiance and disappointment to him. Before I blacked out completely, a flashback seared through my mind. His face twisted with rage veins bulging across his forehead, his fists clenched like hammers. The living room light above us had cast long shadows across the walls, while David, my older brother, stood by smirking. I remembered the impact of the last punch, the sharp crack of knuckle against bone, the air leaving my lungs in a violent rush. I fell to the floor, gasping, clutching at nothing, feeling my chest seize with pain. I could hear his voice shouting above me, a voice that had once told bedtime stories and promised to protect me. Now that voice was condemning me, reducing me to nothing more than an obstacle in his devotion to David. Back at Linda's door, the world swayed. My knuckles tapped feebly against the wood before my arm dropped uselessly at my side. I leaned forward, forehead pressed against the cool surface, praying she would wake up, praying someone would care enough to answer. The porch light flicked on, suddenly bright and startling. The door swung open and Linda stood there in her nightgown, eyes wide in horror as she took in the sight of me on my knees, my shirt torn, my face swollen and streaked with blood. "Emily, dear God, what happened to you?" I tried to form words, but my throat seized. I coughed and tasted iron. My lips moved soundlessly before I forced a whisper past the pain. "Dad, he—" Linda bent down quickly, her hands trembling as she tried to steady me. She pulled me up under her arm, guiding me into the hallway where the scent of lavender candles still lingered from the evening. The warmth of her house pressed against my frozen skin. She grabbed her phone from the side table, her fingers already dialing. I could hear the faint, steady tone as she put the phone to her ear. 911, she said breathlessly. "I need an ambulance. My neighbor is hurt." Panic surged through me stronger than the pain in my ribs. I reached out, gripping her wrist with what little strength remained. "No, please, not yet." Her eyes flashed at me in disbelief. "Emily, you need help. You are bleeding. You can barely breathe." I shook my head, each movement shooting agony through my chest. "He has friends in the force. If they know right away, he will bury this like last time. The last time he hurt me, it disappeared. No report, no file, just silence. Please." Linda froze, torn between fear and compassion. Her hand hovered over the phone. She looked at me, really looked, and saw the desperation in my eyes. Slowly, she lowered the phone. She pulled me fully into the living room, laying me gently on the couch. The cushions sank under my weight as she fetched a towel, pressing it carefully against the cut on my temple. Her hands were steady now, though her lips pressed tight with anger. "Who did this to you?" My breath hitched. My voice cracked. "My father." Linda drew in a sharp breath, her chest rising with shock. She looked away for a moment as if trying to understand how the man everyone in town still called Sheriff Carter could do this to his own daughter. I could see her shaking her head, her face pale. I felt the tears run hot across my bruised cheeks. My body trembled with exhaustion, but my mind was still caught in the echo of his words. "I only have one son." Over and over the sentence looped, drowning me in shame and fury. Linda placed her hand over mine. "You are safe here, Emily. He is not going to hurt you tonight." But even as she spoke, I could feel the weight of his power pressing in the shadow of his connections, his reputation, his history as sheriff. It was not just a man who had beaten me bloody. It was a man who had once been the law of this town, who still held its respect, who could twist truth into lies with a single word. I closed my eyes, clutching Linda's hand, and whispered again this time with more force. "Do not call them yet. Please. If we do not have proof, he will crush me. He always does." Linda's gaze softened, but the fire in her eyes grew. She nodded once reluctantly. "Then we do this right," she said. "We gather what we need. We make sure he cannot bury it again." Her words faded into the haze of my pain, but they rooted deep. For the first time that night, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe I was not alone. Maybe this time I could fight back. The clock ticked past 1:15. The room was quiet except for the sound of my ragged breathing. I stared at the ceiling, every muscle aching, and thought of the life that had led me here. My father had declared me invisible, denied me as his child, and broken my body. But lying on Linda's couch, blood still wet on my face, I felt the first spark of something stronger than fear. I felt the beginning of defiance, and with that spark came the knowledge that this night was only the beginning of a battle I could no longer avoid. I grew up in a house where silence was louder than any scream, and where approval was a currency I never owned. My mother died when I was only 8 years old. A sudden illness that took her from me before I could even grasp what losing a parent truly meant. After she was gone, the walls of our home grew colder, the air heavier, and the man who was left to raise us, my father, Frank Carter, became both my provider and my greatest source of fear. Frank was not just any man in town. He was the sheriff, the law itself, the man whose name commanded respect in every corner of the county. People tipped their hats to him at the diner, business owners shook his hand like he was their savior, and neighbors spoke of him as if he were untouchable. To them, he was Sheriff Carter, a symbol of authority and justice. To me, he was the man who looked right through me as if I barely existed. He only ever had eyes for David, my older brother. David was 2 years older than me, broad-shouldered, even as a boy, quick with a smirk that could charm teachers and neighbors alike. Father boasted about him to anyone who would listen. "That's my son," he'd say with pride in his voice, pointing to David after a little league game or when he helped fix a fence post. With me, there was nothing. No praise, no proud glances, just the occasional barked order or sigh of disappointment. While David was showered with allowance money and new baseball gloves, I was handed chores and silence. By the time I was 10, I knew how to scrub floors until they shone, cook dinners for 3 without burning a pan, and iron David's shirts so he could look sharp when he went out. If I did well, there was no acknowledgement. If I faltered, if I burned the toast or folded the laundry wrong. Father's glare bore down on me like a hammer. Sometimes his hand would follow. The belt, the slap, the shove against the wall. Nothing that left marks too visible, but enough to remind me I was less. At school, I learned to smile to laugh louder than the hollow sound in my chest, because if anyone asked how things were at home, I wanted them to believe the lie I carried. Frank Carter's daughter could not be seen as weak. The town adored him too much. Teachers praised David for his achievements, and when they looked at me, they often compared. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" The words burrowed into my bones like poison. I learned early that being born his daughter meant being invisible unless I was in the way. I can still remember nights sitting by the window watching the glow of Frank's patrol car headlights as he returned from late shifts. David would run to the door, and Father would ruffle his hair, laugh, and hand him small tokens, a badge-shaped keychain, a sheriff's hat, little pieces of his world that he shared only with his son. I watched from the stairs, longing for even a fraction of that warmth. But when his eyes met mine, the laughter died, replaced by a sharpness that cut deeper than any bruise. "Go to bed, Emily," he would order, and I obeyed, swallowing the lump in my throat. I found solace in my mother's memory, clutching the faded photograph I kept hidden in my dresser drawer, her smile frozen in time. Sometimes I whispered to her, asking why she left me with a man who could not love me, but there was no answer. Only the silence of a house where I was treated like a shadow. By the time I was a teenager, I had given up expecting affection. I poured myself into school, into books, into the hope that if I worked hard enough, I could escape. While David basked in father's praise and squandered opportunities, I stayed up late with a lamp burning, memorizing anatomy diagrams, dreaming of a life where I could help others heal. But at home, dreams were worthless. My father would sneer if he caught me reading. "Books won't make you a Carter," he would spit, as if being a Carter was some badge of honor I could never earn. I learned to hide my ambition to tuck my textbooks beneath the mattress to keep my head down when Frank boasted about his son's potential. I carried bruises on my arms and words etched into my heart that told me I was less, that I was disposable. And though I smiled for the world outside, inside, I was a girl desperate to breathe in a house that suffocated me. The truth was that I had been disappearing long before that night at 1 in the morning when I collapsed at Linda's door. I had been fading for years, erased by a father who declared I only have one son and a brother who basked in that twisted devotion. All along, I wondered if maybe he was right, if maybe in his eyes I was never truly his daughter at all. That doubt followed me like a ghost, shaping every step I took, every decision I made. And it was in those shadows of childhood that the seeds of the night's violence were planted, seeds that would one day grow into the storm that nearly destroyed me. Leaving home had once felt like the only way to breathe. When I graduated high school, I packed a small suitcase and boarded a bus to the city where no one knew me as Frank Carter's daughter. I studied nursing, working night shifts at a diner to cover rent, and for the first time I felt a hint of independence, a fragile kind of freedom that I protected fiercely. In the hospital training program, I found a place where hard work mattered more than last names, where patients looked at me with gratitude and colleagues respected my dedication. I thought I had finally built a life beyond my father's shadow. For years, I avoided going back to that small town, answering David's sporadic calls with short replies and ignoring the weight of guilt that clung to me whenever I thought of the man who had raised me with iron fists and colder words. But then the phone rang one afternoon, and it was not David's mocking voice. It was a neighbor, breathless and grave. "Your father's heart is failing, Emily. He needs someone to take care of him." For a moment, I considered refusing. After all the pain, after the years of being nothing in his eyes, why should I return? But blood ties are chains hard to break, and guilt whispered that maybe I owed him something, that maybe this was a chance to prove I was not as cold as he had been to me. Against my better judgment, I packed my bag and boarded another bus, this time not with dreams, but with dread. The moment I stepped off at the station, the town looked unchanged, as if frozen in time. The diner with its flickering neon sign, the gas station with its cracked pavement, the courthouse standing proud at the center of Main Street. And everywhere I went, people nodded with the same respect I remembered. "Sheriff Carter's daughter," they murmured, smiling with pity or curiosity. It was as if the years had not moved, as if my father's reputation had not aged a day. At the house, the paint on the porch had peeled the yard untended, but inside I found Frank sitting in his recliner, older but no less commanding. His hair was grayer, his face heavier, but his eyes still burned with that same sharpness. He looked at me as though my return was expected, not appreciated. "You took your time," he muttered, as if the years of silence were my fault alone. I forced a smile, reminding myself he was sick, reminding myself I had come to help. But it was David who unsettled me most. He was lounging at the kitchen table, a bottle of beer sweating in his hand, even though it was barely noon. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes glassy. I learned quickly that he had not managed to hold a job in years, drifting from one failed attempt to another, always returning to the safety of our father's house. Yet when neighbors passed by, Frank still introduced him with pride, still called him his son, his legacy. And me, I was the one cooking again, cleaning again, measuring medication, and keeping track of appointments as if nothing had changed. At the grocery store, strangers stopped to shake Frank's hand, their voices full of admiration. "Sheriff Carter, you still look strong. Sheriff Carter, it is good to see you out." They glanced at me only long enough to nod, then turned back to him, their respect flowing only one way. Even at church, where hymns filled the air with promises of grace, I felt the weight of their eyes. People whispered that it was good I had come home to do my duty. No one questioned why David was not lifting a finger, why he spent his nights drinking at the bar and his days sleeping on the couch. Frank's legend still held, and in the shadow of that legend, I was invisible again. Nights became the hardest. I would sit on the porch after Frank had gone to bed, listening to the crickets, staring at the stars, wondering why I had returned. The city seemed so far away, my life as a nurse, like a dream I had woken from. Here I was, once again, the daughter who did not matter, the girl who had never been enough. Sometimes Linda would wave from across the street, her smile kind, her eyes full of questions she did not voice. She had known me since I was a child, and though she had never seen the bruises, she had always sensed the chill in our house. I found comfort in her presence, a reminder that not everyone was fooled by Frank's charm. Still, the house pressed on me with its silence, with the weight of old memories. I could not forget the way my father's voice echoed in every room, or the way David looked at me with the same smirk he had worn when I was beaten years ago. Coming back had not healed anything. It had only placed me back in the storm I had once escaped, and yet I stayed convincing myself that duty demanded it, that family required sacrifice, even when that sacrifice came at the expense of my own soul. I did not yet know that the decision to return would ignite a conflict that would nearly destroy me. A conflict where blood and loyalty would clash until only truth remained. It did not take long for the cracks in the fragile routine to widen. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was here only to help with medication and meals, that I could ignore the slights, the favoritism, the way Frank looked past me as if I were nothing more than a housekeeper. But truth has a way of rising to the surface. One evening, I found David in the living room with a stack of papers spread across the coffee table. He was half drunk, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes sharp with a gleam I had come to know too well. Frank sat nearby his cane, leaning against the chair, his voice low but firm as he pointed at the documents. When they noticed me standing in the doorway, David smirked as if my presence was irrelevant. "We are finalizing the sale," he said with a casual shrug. "The land by the river, the one that has been in our family for generations, is going to clear a good chunk of debt." My stomach dropped. That land had been my grandfather's pride, acres of soil he had tended with his own hands. I remembered summers running through the tall grass, chasing fireflies, hearing my mother laugh under the wide sky. It was the last piece of her I still held on to. "You cannot sell it," I said firmly, stepping closer. "That land belongs to all of us, and it is not yours to gamble away." Frank's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Watch your tone, Emily. You forget who built this family's name. That land is mine to decide." I shook my head, fury rising in my chest. "It is not yours to throw away on David's drinking or your debts. It is our heritage." Mother's memory. David laughed, a bitter sound that cut through the air. "Heritage," he sneered. "What heritage? You were never part of this family, Emily. You think showing up after years away gives you a say. This family was never yours." The words sliced through me, reopening old wounds. I turned to my father, waiting for him to silence David, to remind him I was his daughter too. But Frank did not defend me. His eyes burned with anger as he rose slowly from his chair, his hand trembling as he leaned on the cane. "You will not speak to me that way in my house," he thundered. And before I could move, his hand lashed out across my face. The slap was sharp, stinging, the sound echoing in the room. For a moment, I stood frozen, my cheek burning, my heart pounding. It was the first time in years he had struck me, and yet it felt as if all the years of silence, of dismissal, of cruelty had culminated in that single blow. I gasped, trying to steady myself, my fingers brushing the tender skin already swelling. "You cannot keep doing this," I whispered, my voice trembling but defiant. "I am not a child anymore." His face contorted with rage. "You will always be the weak one, the mistake. David is my blood, my son. You are nothing but a burden." My knees wavered, the weight of his words heavier than the slap. David leaned back, sipping his beer with a grin, enjoying every moment of my humiliation. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as if the house itself rejected me. I wanted to scream to hurl the papers from the table to expose the corruption and lies. But my body froze, my voice caught. I realized then that nothing had changed. Returning home had placed me back in the same chains I had once fought so hard to escape. That night, I retreated to my room, my face, throbbing tears, soaking the pillow as I stared at the ceiling. I thought of my patients in the city, the lives I had touched, the independence I had carved out. And here I was, again reduced to silence by a man who claimed I was not his. Rage boiled beneath my grief, a silent vow forming in the darkness. They would not take that land. They would not erase me. I had survived years of being invisible, and though I trembled now, I knew the storm was only beginning. The first sparks of conflict had been struck, and soon they would ignite into a fire none of us could escape. The days after the argument over the land were thick with tension like storm clouds hanging over the house waiting to break. I tried to avoid both of them keeping to my chores and slipping away to the porch when I could. But no matter how quiet I made myself, the weight of their presence pressed on me. David grew bolder, strutting around with his beer in hand, mocking me with sly comments whenever Frank was near, knowing full well our father would never defend me. Frank himself seemed to smolder, his voice sharper, his eyes harder, as if my defiance over the land had awakened an anger he had buried, but never lost. Then came the night everything shattered. It was late, the clock close to midnight, when I came into the living room and saw David rifling through a drawer where I had kept some of my mother's belongings. He held her old necklace in his hand, the one she wore every Sunday to church, the only piece of her I had left. "Put that down," I demanded, stepping forward. David twirled the chain between his fingers, smirking. "Why," he sneered, "it is not like you are part of this family. Father and I could sell this for a few bucks at the bar." Before I could snatch it back, Frank's voice boomed from his chair. "Enough!" His cane hit the floor as he stood, his chest heaving. "Emily, you do not tell your brother what to do in this house. He is my son, my only son." The words hit me like a physical blow, dredging up years of being cast aside. Rage broke through my fear. "I am your daughter too," I shouted, my voice trembling with a mixture of pain and fury. "You do not get to erase me." For a second, the room froze silence as heavy as stone. Then Frank moved. His hand came first, slapping me so hard my head snapped to the side, my cheek exploding with pain. I stumbled but caught myself, my chest rising with ragged breaths. "Do not touch me again," I warned, though my voice shook, his face twisted with fury. Without warning, his fist connected with my stomach, the force driving the air from my lungs. I doubled over, gasping, clutching my ribs as fire shot through my chest. He struck again, his knuckles cracking against my jaw, stars bursting across my vision. I fell to the floor, the carpet rough against my palms, my body screaming with every movement. I could hear David laughing, his voice cruel and sharp like a knife twisting in the wound. "Father, you will kill her!" He jeered, but he did not move to stop him. Frank loomed above me, his fists clenched, his breath ragged. "You dare stand against me, against your own blood. You are nothing, Emily. Nothing." He hauled me up by my arm, his grip like iron, and slammed me against the wall. The picture frames rattled one, falling to the ground and shattering. My ribs burned, my vision blurred, but I forced myself to meet his eyes. "I will not let you sell that land," I gasped, "even if you kill me." His face turned red, spit flying, as he roared, "I only have one son." The words echoed each syllable, a hammer against my soul. Then his fist drove into my chest one final time, and my knees buckled. I collapsed to the floor, clutching my side, choking on air that would not come. The taste of blood filled my mouth, metallic and bitter. David's laughter faded into a dull roar in my ears as I crawled toward the door, each movement agony. My father stood there looming like a shadow, his voice cold and final. "You were never mine." His words sliced deeper than any bruise. Somehow I found the strength to push myself up, staggering toward the night, the cool air hitting my swollen face as I stumbled out the door. My body screamed with every step, but survival dragged me forward across the dark yard, down the quiet street. The lights of Linda's porch glowed faintly in the distance like a beacon. Each breath was a battle, each step a war. My father's voice still echoed in my head, but I forced my body forward. Blood dripped down my chin, soaking into my shirt. My vision swam the world, tilting with every stride. When I finally reached her porch, my legs gave out. I collapsed against the door, my fist weak as it tapped against the wood, my voice barely a whisper. "Help me." And with that, darkness closed in. The night air cut cold against my skin as I slumped against Linda's front door, every breath tearing through my chest like broken glass. My knuckles tapped weakly on the wood, each knock softer than the last, until my strength gave out and my forehead rested against the frame. The world swayed, tilting in and out of darkness, but I forced myself to hold on, clinging to the faint glow of her porch light as if it were the only star left in the sky. From somewhere deep inside, I heard the echo of his words again. I only have one son, and the shame and fury surged together, pressing tears from my swollen eyes. Then the sound of hurried footsteps echoed inside, and the porch light blazed to life, washing me in a flood of yellow. The door swung open, and Linda Hayes stood there in her robe, her hair messy from sleep, her eyes widening with horror as she saw me crumpled on her porch. "Emily, dear Lord, above what happened?" she gasped, her voice shaking as she crouched down to grab my shoulders. Her hands trembled as she pulled me upright, and I sagged against her, my ribs screaming as she tried to lift me inside. Blood trickled from the corner of my mouth, staining the collar of my shirt, and my breath came in shallow rasps. "My father," I managed to whisper before my throat seized, forcing me to cough violently, the taste of iron flooding my tongue. Linda dragged me into the hallway, guiding me onto her couch, her face pale with panic. She snatched her phone from the side table, her fingers already punching in the numbers. 911, I heard her say, her voice urgent. "My neighbor is hurt. She is bleeding badly. Please send an ambulance." Terror shot through me sharper than the pain in my chest. I reached out, clutching her wrist with what little strength I had left. My voice raw but desperate. "No, not yet." Her eyes widened, disbelief flashing in them. "Emily, you need a doctor. You need the police. He will kill you if you go back there. Please let me call them." I shook my head, tears spilling as I forced the words out. "He has friends on the force. He will twist everything like he always does." "You do not understand, Linda. This is not the first time. Last time I spoke up, the report disappeared, the bruises dismissed like it never happened." My voice broke into sobs, my body trembling as if the memory itself had struck me down again. Linda froze, her thumb hovering over the dial button torn between reason and the raw fear she saw in my eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered the phone. She pressed her free hand against my temple, trying to stop the bleeding with a towel she had grabbed from the kitchen. Her face was tight with anger. Now her lips pressed into a thin line as she whispered, "He cannot keep doing this to you. You are not alone anymore, Emily. You hear me. You are safe here." I wanted to believe her, but the shadow of Frank Carter stretched long in my mind. He was not just a man. He was a former sheriff, a man the whole town still greeted with respect, a man who had spent years weaving a web of influence that kept him untouchable. To them, he was still the law, still the hero, and I was just the bitter daughter who had run away. My breath rattled in my chest as Linda dabbed carefully at the cut on my lip, her hands steadier now, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, though I could see she already knew. "My father," I choked out, and the words felt like poison on my tongue. She drew in a sharp breath, shaking her head in disbelief. "Sheriff Carter," she muttered under her breath, almost as if saying it aloud might summon the man himself. For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall and my ragged breathing. Linda's gaze locked with mine, and I saw something fierce ignite in her eyes. "Then we will do it the right way," she said firmly. "We will gather proof, and we will not let him bury this again." I clung to her words like a lifeline, though doubt still gnawed at me. Pain throbbed through my body with every breath, and exhaustion threatened to pull me under. But deep in my chest, a small spark flickered, faint yet defiant. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope, born not from my own strength, but from the hand of a neighbor who refused to look away. The clock struck 1:15, the sound echoing in the quiet house, marking the moment when my life shifted from silent survival to the beginning of resistance. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments of sound and sensation, the hum of the ambulance engine, the hiss of oxygen near my ear. Linda's hand gripping mine as if she could will me to stay awake. My ribs burned with each jolt, and every breath felt like a knife sliding between them. When the double doors of the emergency room swung open, harsh white light flooded over me, and I felt exposed, fragile, like a broken object on display. Doctors and nurses clustered around, their voices quick and clipped, checking vitals, asking questions I could barely answer. What happened? Where does it hurt? How long ago? I wanted to tell the truth, but fear pressed harder than pain. I could not let my father's name leave my lips in this place, not when I knew how far his influence reached. Sheriff Carter, even in retirement, still had allies in the town, men who had worked under him, doctors who owed him favors, officers who respected his legacy. If his daughter accused him, it would be my word against his, and my word had always been worthless in his eyes. A young nurse whispered something to a doctor as they wheeled me toward X-ray. Her eyes lingered on the bruises blooming across my ribs, the swelling around my eye, the cut on my lip. I saw suspicion in her gaze, but also hesitation. They had seen cases like mine before, women hurt behind closed doors, stories swallowed in silence. But the weight of my father's name hung in the air, unspoken, yet undeniable. Hours passed. The diagnosis came back with fractured ribs, severe contusions, and signs of repeated trauma. I lay in the hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding me, while Linda sat in the chair at my side, her jaw tight with worry. For a brief moment, I thought maybe the truth would finally have its chance to breathe. But then the door opened, and in walked Frank and David. My father wore a mask of concern, his eyes darting around the room as though calculating the scene, while David leaned against the wall with arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. My stomach churned at the sight of them. "Emily," my father said, his voice full of false warmth, "we came as soon as we heard." "What happened, sweetheart? Did you fall again?" I froze, bile rising in my throat. Linda stood immediately, her body stiff, her voice sharp. "She did not fall. You know exactly what happened." Frank's gaze flicked to her cold and steady before turning back to the doctor who had just entered. "Sheriff Carter." The doctor greeted him respectfully as if the title still belonged to him. "She fell down the stairs," Frank said smoothly, his voice calm, authoritative, the way it always was when he spun lies. "Isn't that right, Emily?" My lips parted, but no sound came out. My body screamed with pain, but fear screamed louder. If I denied him now, if I dared to tell the truth without proof, he would bury it just as he had before. David chuckled under his breath, and rage burned through me, but still I said nothing. The doctor glanced between us uneasy, but Frank's reputation filled the silence. He scribbled vague notes on the chart words that erased the fists, the kicks, the blood. Contusion, accidental fall, patient unstable. Sheriff Carter murmured thanks, and that was that. The truth vanished in ink. Linda seethed, her fists clenched at her sides. She looked ready to explode, but I caught her arm, my fingers weak, yet pleading. "Not now," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please, later." Frank leaned closer to me, his breath hot against my ear. "Remember who you are speaking against," he muttered low enough that only I could hear. "Do not make a mistake you will regret." My blood ran cold. He straightened, patted my blanket as though he were a caring father, and left the room with David trailing behind him. The door closed, and the silence they left behind pressed down heavier than their presence. Linda turned to me, her eyes blazing with fury. "How long are you going to let him do this, Emily? How long before he kills you?" Tears welled in my eyes, spilling onto my bruised cheeks. "I do not know." I whispered, but the words tasted bitter. Because deep down, I did know. If I stayed silent, if I let him twist the story again one day, his fists would not stop short of ending me. The beeping monitor echoed in the room, steady and relentless like a countdown. In that sterile bed, surrounded by the stench of disinfectant and the shadow of my father's lies, I realized silence was no longer an option. If I wanted to survive, I would have to fight, even if it meant standing against the man who claimed I was not his daughter. When I was discharged from the hospital a few days later, the bruises still painted across my skin like dark fingerprints of betrayal. I thought I might find relief in the quiet of my own bed. Instead, I found that the town itself had turned against me. News traveled quickly in a place like ours, where coffee at the diner was served with a side of gossip and church pews doubled as confessionals. At first, it was subtle the way eyes followed me when I walked into the grocery store, the way conversations hushed when I passed by. I tried to keep my head high, but the whispers still reached my ears. Poor girl, always dramatic. She probably fell again. Some said I was unstable, others that I was trying to smear my father's good name. A few even claimed I had made up the injuries to get attention or sympathy. What hurt most was how easily they believed him. Frank Carter, former sheriff man of law and order, could not possibly be guilty of beating his daughter bloody. No, it had to be me, the bitter girl who ran off to the city and came crawling back. At the hardware store, two men I had known since childhood stood by the counter, their voices low, but not low enough. Sheriff Carter always carried this town on his back, one said. That girl should be grateful. Instead, she makes up stories. The other nodded, spitting into a cup. Some daughters do not know how to respect their fathers. My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. I carried my bag of supplies out the door, my ears burning with humiliation. At church the following Sunday, the congregation greeted Frank with warm smiles and handshakes. They asked after his health, they praised David for helping his father. They spoke of family loyalty and respect. When I walked past, their smiles faltered. Some nodded politely, others avoided my eyes altogether. Even the pastor's wife, who had once held me on her lap during Sunday school, patted my arm with pity and whispered, Emily, you really should not speak ill of your father. He has done so much for this community. My throat burned with unshed tears as I took my seat at the back, the hymns sounding hollow in my ears. Each whisper, each glance carved deeper into me than any bruise. It was as though the entire town had been drafted into his army, marching to the beat of his reputation, and I was the enemy. Linda remained by my side, her presence a shield against the worst of it. She held her head high when we walked together, glaring down anyone who dared to mutter. Still, I could see the strain in her eyes, the frustration of fighting a battle that seemed unwinnable. One evening she found me sitting on her porch, staring out at the fading light with tears streaming down my face. They all hate me, I whispered. They think I am lying. Linda's voice was firm, steady as stone. Let them whisper. You and I know the truth, and one day the truth will be louder than their lies. I wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at me. My father's influence ran deep, built over decades of service and control. He had worn the badge not just as a job, but as armor, a way to cement himself as the town's hero. Even without the title, the shadow of his authority lingered, and David, with his easy lies and smug smirk, fed those whispers like dry kindling to flame. One afternoon, I overheard two women outside the market. They clutched their bags of groceries, shaking their heads. Did you hear what David said? He claims Emily threw herself against the wall in some hysterical fit. Poor Frank is sick and stressed, and she is making it worse. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. My fists clenched so tight my nails cut into my palms. They believed him. They all believed him. That night alone in Linda's spare room, I stared at my bruised reflection in the mirror. The swelling was fading, but the shame remained an ugly reminder of how quickly truth could be twisted into lies. I pressed my fingers to the tender skin along my ribs, each ache whispering the memory of fists, and I swore silently to myself that I would not let his lies define me. Even if the whole town stood against me, I would find a way to make them see. The whispers might have drowned me once, but now they fueled the fire in my chest. They thought I was weak, invisible, a shadow beneath Frank Carter's legend. They were wrong. One day they would see the truth carved into the very fabric of this town, and they would remember the daughter he tried to erase. The weight of the town's judgment pressed down like a storm cloud, but in the midst of it, I began to see flickers of light, small yet steady signs that not everyone was willing to be blinded by Frank's reputation. Linda was the first, of course. She offered me more than shelter. She gave me strength. Every morning she set a plate of eggs and toast in front of me and refused to let me slip into despair. When neighbors whispered, she met their stares head on, daring them to say the words to her face. "You are not alone," she told me over and over until the words became a rope I clung to in the darkness. Then there was Sheriff Caldwell, the man who had taken over when Frank retired. He came by Linda's house one evening, his uniform crisp, his expression calm but watchful. He asked to speak with me privately, and we sat on the porch where the cicadas hummed in the trees. His voice was low measured. "I know something is wrong, Emily. I can see it plain as day. But if you want this to stick, you need more than words. You need proof." He leaned closer, his gaze steady. "Your father still has friends in the department. If you go to them now, they will bury it. But if you gather evidence, if you show them something they cannot deny, then they will have no choice." My throat tightened as I nodded, grateful and afraid all at once. He was not promising protection, not yet, but he was offering guidance, and that was more than I had dared hope for. Later, Linda introduced me to Miles Johnson, a lawyer she trusted. He was a tall man with gray hair at his temples, his eyes sharp but kind. He listened quietly as I told him what had happened, his hands folded on the desk. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "Emily, if you take this on, it is going to be hell," he said plainly. "Your father is powerful here. He will not go down quietly. He will fight you with every connection, every trick he knows." I hesitated. My stomach knotted, but then I remembered the echo of his fist, the words, "I only have one son." I straightened in my chair, my voice steady, though my hands trembled. "Then let him fight. I am done being silent." Miles studied me for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right, we build a case, carefully, step by step. Do not underestimate him, but do not let him scare you into silence." When I left his office that evening, the sun was setting in streaks of orange across the sky, and for the first time since that night on Linda's porch, I felt a flicker of control. The battle ahead loomed large, but I was no longer walking into it alone. Linda's faith, Caldwell's advice, Miles's willingness to stand with me, they were threads that began to weave into a net fragile but strong enough to catch me if I fell. Back at Linda's, I sat by the window watching the shadows stretch across the street. My body still ached, the bruises still tender, but deep in my chest a fire had begun to burn. I thought of my father's words, of the pride he lavished on David while denying me of the fists that had left me gasping on the floor. If he wanted the world to believe he only had one son, then I would show him what his daughter could do. I would gather proof. I would fight his lies. I would tear down the legend he hid behind and make him face the truth he had buried for years. And as the night deepened, as the town whispered against me, I whispered back a vow into the darkness: I will not be erased. The days that followed turned into a quiet war fought in shadows and whispers, each step deliberate, each move heavy with risk. Linda became my anchor. Her home, the base where plans were whispered late into the night over cups of coffee gone cold. I began with the simplest thing I could control, documenting my wounds. Each morning, I stood in front of the mirror with Linda's old digital camera, lifting my shirt to expose the purple and yellow bruises spreading across my ribs, tilting my face to catch the swelling around my eye, opening my mouth to reveal the split lip that still throbbed when I tried to smile. I held a newspaper up in each frame to mark the date, my hands trembling, as the flash seared proof into pixels. Every picture felt like both a wound and a weapon. A reminder of my pain, but also a piece of evidence my father could not deny. At night, when David drank himself into a stupor, I carried a small recorder in my pocket. I pretended to tidy up the kitchen while he rambled, his voice slurred with arrogance. One evening, he laughed, bragging to a friend on the phone, "Dad nearly killed her, man. You should have seen it." My stomach clenched as I pressed the recorder tighter against the table, the words searing into my soul, even as I knew they were the very ammunition I needed. Then came the papers. David was careless when drunk, leaving documents scattered across the counter. I found a set of forged signatures on land transfer forms, my name and my mother's name clumsily copied, the ink fresh. My hands shook as I slipped them into my bag, the weight of fraud heavy in my chest. I knew the land was their prize, the treasure they would destroy everything to claim, and now I had proof of their deceit. Linda offered more than comfort. She offered her security camera footage. Together, we sat in her kitchen as she rewound the feed to that night, the screen showing me at her door, bloodied and broken, knocking weakly, whispering for help. I wanted to look away, to erase the image of myself collapsed and desperate, but I forced my eyes to stay. We saved the footage onto a USB drive, backing it up twice, the file labeled with the date and time. Each piece was a brick in the wall I was building against him. Sheriff Caldwell checked in discreetly, never in uniform, always careful to avoid suspicion. He reminded me to keep duplicates to hide the originals somewhere safe. Miles, the lawyer, reviewed what I had, his voice steady as he laid the items out on his desk. Photos, recordings, forged documents, video evidence. He tapped the table thoughtfully. "This is good, Emily. Not enough to bring him down yet, but enough to make cracks in the facade. We will need more. Witnesses, if possible." My chest tightened. Who would dare stand with me in a town where my father was still the hero? But then I remembered Linda's determined face, Caldwell's quiet support. Maybe there were more like them, silent for now, waiting for someone to show them it was possible. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of Linda's spare room, my body aching, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and resolve. I thought of the years of silence, of the little girl who had once hidden her books under her pillow, of the teenager who had run to the city to escape, of the woman who had collapsed at 1 a.m. on a neighbor's porch. Each version of me had carried the weight of his denial, his violence, his words. I only have one son. Now those words no longer broke me. They fueled me. With every photo, every recording, every document tucked into the growing file, I felt the balance shift ever so slightly. I was not just a victim anymore. I was becoming the witness, the accuser, the daughter who would force the town to see the truth. And though fear still gripped me, I held on to one unshakable vow: I would not let him bury me again. This time, I would fight. The courthouse smelled of dust and old wood, its benches creaking under the weight of neighbors who had come not out of duty but out of hunger for spectacle. By the time I walked through the doors, the place was already crowded, whispers rippling through the air like wind in tall grass. Linda walked beside me, her chin high, her hand brushing mine as if to steady me. Miles, the lawyer, carried the heavy file of evidence, his shoulders squared, while Sheriff Caldwell gave a discreet nod from the back of the room. At the front sat my father, Frank Carter, dressed in an impeccable suit that barely concealed his bulk. His hair was combed neatly. His cane rested by his chair, and his expression carried that familiar mixture of authority and contempt. To his right sat David, arms crossed, his smirk daring me to meet his eyes. Their lawyer, a man brought in from the city with a reputation for tearing apart witnesses, adjusted his tie and whispered in Frank's ear. The judge entered, the bailiff called for order, and the trial began. Miles opened with a calm, deliberate voice, laying out the charges. Domestic assault, fraud, intimidation. His words rang steady, each syllable careful, carrying the weight of truth. Then he presented the evidence. The photos of my bruises projected on the screen drew gasps from the gallery. People shifted uncomfortably as the images appeared one after another, dated and stamped undeniable. I sat rigid, my hands clenched in my lap, forcing myself not to look away from the proof of my own pain. Next came the recording of David's drunken brag, his voice slurred but clear. "Dad nearly killed her." The room buzzed with whispers, the judge banging his gavel to restore order. Linda took the stand, her voice unwavering as she described the night she found me collapsed at her door. When the footage from her security camera played, showing my bloodied body knocking faintly before collapsing, the silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. My father shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for allies. Then came the land transfer papers, the signatures shaky and obviously forged. Romero from the registry testified quietly, explaining how David had brought them in, claiming to represent us. Miles held up the copies, his voice sharp. "Fraud," he declared. theft under the guise of family loyalty." The crowd murmured their certainty, beginning to waver. But then it was their turn. Frank's lawyer rose, his voice booming, his confidence radiating. He painted me as unstable, ungrateful, a woman desperate for attention. He claimed the injuries were from a fall, that the photos were exaggerated, that the neighbor was biased. He turned to me with a sneer. "You ran away for years, Miss Carter. You left your sick father and troubled brother to fend for themselves. Now you return and suddenly claim abuse. Isn't it true you simply want control of the land?" My chest tightened, but Miles raised a hand, objecting sharply. The judge allowed the question. I lifted my chin, my voice quiet but steady. "No. I came back to care for a father who never cared for me. I came back because family meant more to me than it ever did to him." A ripple moved through the room, some faces softening, others hardening with disbelief. Finally, they called my father. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, projecting the image of a frail old man wronged by his daughter's lies. His voice was smooth, confident, the same tone that had once commanded a town. "My daughter is confused," he said, glancing at the judge with mournful eyes. "She has always resented me for loving her brother more. I tried to raise her, but she turned her back on us. She is not well. She imagines things." He paused, then, with deliberate cruelty, added, "She is no daughter of mine." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Gasps erupted. Whispers flared, the judge demanding silence. My heart clenched, but instead of crumbling, I felt the fire rise. When Miles called me to the stand, I walked forward on shaking legs, but with my head high. I swore the oath, then looked directly at the people who had whispered against me, the ones who had believed his lies. My voice was low but steady. "I am a nurse. I spend my days healing others, but at home I was never safe. My father told me again and again that I did not matter, that he only had one son. In the night he beat me until I could not breathe, those words became his truth." I paused, scanning the room, meeting the eyes of those who had turned away from me in the streets. "He is not a hero. He is not the man you think he is. He is an abuser and a liar." Murmurs rippled again, but this time they felt different, heavier, thoughtful. The judge leaned forward, his face unreadable. When Denise, my father's mistress, was brought forward unexpectedly by Miles, her testimony drove the final nail. She admitted to the affair, admitted to the promises of land, admitted that she had seen Frank's rage with her own eyes. Frank exploded, slamming his cane against the floor, his voice rising in fury. "She lies. They all lie. She is nothing. That girl is nothing." The judge pounded his gavel, warning him to sit, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped. The townspeople who had once believed in him now saw the rage unmasked, the contempt bared. The trial stretched into the afternoon, arguments volleyed back and forth, but the tide had shifted. The evidence stood, the witnesses held firm, and the man who had been sheriff, who had been untouchable for decades, was finally cornered by the truth he could no longer bury. When the judge finally rose to read the verdict, the room was silent. Every breath held, every gaze fixed on the man who had once ruled them all. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy as the judge's voice rang out each word, deliberate, echoing against the paneled walls. The forged land documents were declared null and void, stripped of any legal standing. The property, the last link to my mother's memory, would remain untouched, safe from the greedy hands that had tried to claim it. My father was found guilty of fraud and domestic assault. Though his failing health spared him prison time, the judge sentenced him to strict probation, mandatory counseling, and a lifetime protective order preventing him from coming near me. David was not so fortunate. The evidence of his role in forging signatures and filing false documents was irrefutable. The bailiff stepped forward as the judge pronounced his sentence 5 years for fraud and conspiracy. I watched as David's smirk faltered for the first time, his face paling as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He turned once toward my father, his eyes wide with panic, but Frank only stared straight ahead, his lips pressed into a thin line. The gallery buzzed with shock. The same neighbors who had once whispered that I was unstable now sat in stunned silence, the truth undeniable before them. Some bowed their heads ashamed. Others looked at me with something like remorse. Linda squeezed my hand, her eyes brimming with pride. Sheriff Caldwell gave me a firm nod, and Miles, calm and steady as ever, leaned close and whispered, "You did it, Emily. You stood up and they listened." My throat tightened, tears pricking my eyes, but I held them back until the gavel struck and the courtroom began to empty. As I stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, the sunlight warmed my bruised skin, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to free. The town would take time to change, I knew. Some would cling to the myth of Sheriff Carter, refusing to let go of the hero they had built in their minds. But others, those who had seen his mask slip, would begin to question, to reconsider, to believe. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my work as a nurse, carrying my story quietly alongside me. Patients came and went, each with their own wounds, their own pain, and I found myself offering not just medicine, but words of comfort drawn from the ashes of my own struggle. One afternoon, a young woman sat in the exam room, her arm bruised, her eyes haunted. She whispered excuses. I had once whispered myself I fell. I tripped. "It is nothing." I placed my hand gently over hers and met her gaze. "You are not alone," I told her softly. "Silence only feeds the monster." She stared at me, her eyes filling, and for a moment I saw myself reflected there, a girl desperate to be believed. I squeezed her hand, giving her the promise I had once needed so badly. Outside the clinic, the town was quieter now. Some still avoided me, their loyalty to Frank unshaken, but others nodded in respect to small gestures that carried weight. Linda remained my rock, always ready with tea and a steady presence. Sheriff Caldwell kept his word, ensuring that the protective order was enforced, his quiet vigilance a reassurance I had never known from the law before. At night, I sometimes sat on Linda's porch, the same one where I had collapsed months earlier, staring at the stars. The scars on my body had faded, but the memory remained etched deep. Yet instead of breaking me, it had become the foundation of something stronger. My father had tried to erase me with fists and words, declaring I only have one son. But in the end, it was his downfall, his arrogance laid bare for all to see. He lost his reputation, his grip on the town, and the loyalty of those who once feared him. And I found my voice, my strength and allies who reminded me that truth once spoken could not be silenced again. If there was a lesson carved from the pain, it was this: silence protects the abuser, but truth frees the victim. And though speaking that truth nearly cost me everything, it gave me back more than I ever imagined. I looked at the stars, breathing deeply, the night air cool and clean. For the first time in my life, I was not just Frank Carter's daughter. I was Emily Carter, survivor fighter, and no longer invisible. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered into the darkness, not in fear, but in triumph, "I will not be erased." Thank you for staying with Emily's journey until the very end, because what you just witnessed was not only a story about pain, but a story about courage, survival, and the power of finally saying enough. Too often in our world, especially in small towns or tight communities, people believe the reputation of a man over the bruises of a woman. They trust the myth more than the truth. And in doing so, they allow monsters to keep walking free. Emily's father hid behind the badge, behind the respect of neighbors, behind decades of being seen as the law itself, and he thought that gave him the right to destroy his own daughter in silence. But what this story shows us is that no matter how powerful the abuser, no matter how many whispers stand against you, the truth once spoken out loud and backed with courage can topple even the strongest facade. And here is where I want to turn to you. If you were Emily, bleeding at 1 a.m, dragging yourself to your neighbor's door with the taste of betrayal still in your mouth, would you stay quiet to protect the family name, or would you risk everything to fight back? Would you let the world believe the whispers? Or would you stand up in the courtroom trembling but unbroken and force them to look at the truth they refused to see? That is the heart of this channel, bringing you stories that force us to ask these questions, to feel that fire in our chest, to look at injustice and say, never again. If Emily's fight lit even the smallest spark inside you, I want you to carry it forward. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Emily's place? Would you have had the strength to face down your own father, your whole town, and demand justice? Or would the fear of being called a liar have silenced you? And while you are down there, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories reach, how they connect us across states, cities, and even continents. And of course, do not forget to hit like and subscribe, because each click, each share helps this community grow and ensures that stories like Emily's do not get buried in the shadows. They deserve to be heard, and you deserve to be part of a community that believes in truth and justice and in the strength of voices that refuse to stay silent. Together we can make sure that silence never wins again.